Perhaps today's American fairy tales no longer begin with the castles of Cinderella or Snow White. It's the story of the middle class. People who were once considered a symbol of stability, the strongest pillar of the American dream. The middle class used to be a symbol of stability, a house, 2 children, a car, and summer vacation. But now it seems like stable takes on the form of a wheeled vehicle. As home prices get out of reach, mortgage interest rates hit historic peaks, and the cost of living devours every salary. Millions of middle-class Americans are leaving the home sweet home dream to find a new reality. Live, work, and make a living on the road. RVs that were once a symbol of freedom, of the desire to explore, have now become a haven for an entire generation trapped between inflation, debt, and the outdated promise called American Dream. In today's video, we'll learn why living in an RV is becoming the new norm for the American middle class, and what that says about the truth behind the disappearing American dream. Just a few decades ago, in America, a single parent could still work full-time, raise children, and buy a home. That story now sounds like a fairy tale. Nowadays, even people with college degrees, stable jobs, and good income still have to live paycheck to paycheck, who just received their salary and spent it all on bills, with no extra money left over for emergency or retirement. They are not poor, but they are no longer safe and stable. Middle class group was once considered the backbone of America, is losing its own foundation. According to Pew Research, in 1971, 61% of American adults were middle class. By 2023, that number is only 50%. A survey by the Federal Reserve shows that 1/3 of middle-income people do not have $400 to spend on emergency expenses. Total US household debt has exceeded $16.5 trillion, of which credit card debt alone reached a record of $1 trillion USD. In other words, if we divide this credit card debt figure among the American middle class per capita, the average person is carrying about $5,556 in credit card debt. Not stopping there, nearly 59% of Americans live without savings, making it possible for a single illness or job loss to pull them off the fine line between stability and collapse. However, their parents used to live in the dawn of the American dream. A house, 2 children, a car, and a summer vacation are always an obvious truth that you just need to trade with effort and a little luck. In 1980, the average home price was only about 3 times annual income, and first-time home buyers were under the age of 30. They can pay off their mortgage before retirement age and enter old age with a sense of peace, believing that their children will have a better life. But the next generation is witnessing the bitter paradox. They learn more, work more, but live worse. Stable, what was once the beginning of parents, is now a lifelong destination that is hard to reach. A person earning more than $100,000 USD a year is still not enough to live comfortably when taxes, insurance, and debt swallow most of their income. And so the first generation in American history with better education and conditions than their parents, but poorer, was born. The cause lies not only in personal mistakes, but in system structure. Over the past 40 years, labor productivity has increased sharply, but the real wages of middle-class workers have only increased by half. House, health, and education prices increased 3 to 4 times compared to income. Economic profits flow mainly into the richest 1%, while welfare policies and pension insurance weaken. More than 57 million Americans work without a savings plan for old age. At the same time, globalization and automation wipe out millions of high-skilled jobs, leaving the middle class trapped in a spiral of escalating costs and shrinking opportunities. As the gap between effort and reward grows, generation rupture becomes pronounced. More than half of Americans no longer believe their children will outlive their parents. Middle class now has a new meaning. No longer living comfortably, but living struggling, but still trying to appear stable. Faith in American dream, belief that working hard will change lives, is being eroded, replaced by a simmering worry. The feeling that I did everything right, but still not enough to survive. If the trend of cost exceeding household income and debt continues, the middle class could disappear from the American social structure over the next 2 decades. The polarization between rich and poor will deepen, leading to political and social instability. The American dream may only remain in their memory as an outdated legacy of parents, not the reality of their children. It's hard to believe that even with a college degree and 2 sources of income, many American families today still struggle to pay for what only one person could easily afford a few decades ago. A small suburban house, a family vacation, or simply the feeling of enough to live, all used to be normal. Now they become a privilege. With millions of middle-class families, each month starts with a spending spreadsheet and ends with a negative number. The numbers are no longer soulless facts on paper, but a report showing that America's once most stable class is living on. Credit borrowed first, living later. Debt is no longer unusual. It becomes the way an entire generation exists. Living standards are maintained not by income, but by the ability to manage loans, talking numbers, and they don't lie. House prices in the US have increased 700–900% since their parents' time, while income has only increased about 16%. Rent in many states exceeds $2,000 a month, accounting for more than 35–40% of the average household's income. College tuition increased 264,400%, medical costs increased 155%, and everything from car insurance to utility bills escalated faster than salaries. Meanwhile, labor productivity has increased steadily each year, but real wages have almost stood still for the past 40 years. The average worker now has to work twice as long to maintain the standard of living their parents once had. This reality is not just a consequence of inflation, but a manifestation of an imbalanced system. Home loan interest rates are currently at their highest level in 2 decades, pushing many people to rent for life instead of owning property. Medical and insurance costs increased relentlessly while corporate benefits were cut. After the 2008 crisis, tax policy again favored financial corporations and real estate, leaving the middle class stuck between not poor enough to receive subsidies, but also not rich enough to receive incentives. Tuition debt becomes a ghost throughout life. Millions of Americans at age 40–50 still pay off college debt to themselves or their children. And with a credit-based consumer system, a middle-class person has to spend an average of 22% of their income just to pay interest. Just a small fluctuation of one gas price increase, one medical bill, or one insurance period is enough to push them into crisis. In that context, the concept of home sweet home, symbol of safety and stability, becomes a luxury dream. A couple with an income of more than $100,000 a year still cannot buy a house in many states, because after deducting taxes, insurance, and debt, there is nothing left to save. Many families are forced to postpone giving birth, cut back on vacations, and even live on credit cards to maintain living. Elderly people continue to work after retirement age. Young people delay independence and living with their parents to save costs. Stability, the foundation of the American middle class, is disappearing, and with it comes a sense of control over the future. They no longer know how to move forward when every effort is just enough to stay in place. If the trend of costs rising faster than income continues, within the next 10–15 years, the majority of the American middle class will fall to the group of just enough to live. A new form of poverty where people still work, still pay taxes, but no longer accumulate. When relying on debt and credit becomes the default model, the middle class will no longer be the class capable of accumulating, but just the debtors capable of paying interest. And if the US economy is built on the purchasing power of the middle class, then when this layer of land collapses, the entire structure above will also tilt. Perhaps today's economic problem is not just the calculation of money, but the equation of faith. Because once people no longer believe that working hard will change their lives, any number is meaningless. Before the pandemic, van life was a symbol of freedom. Cars wheeled on endless roads, minimalist lives, closeness to nature, and separation from the tiring cycle of industrial society. But after 2020, along with shocks in rents, job losses, and prolonged inflation, the dream suddenly changed colour. Van life is no longer the lifestyle of choice, but the mandatory escape of thousands of once middle-class families now unable to keep their roofs. People who used to have stable jobs, suburban housing, or central apartments now have to move into old RVs, trucks, or even hastily renovated SUVs. They call themselves modern nomads. Modern nomads. But many of them admit it's just a way to retain some dignity. A 58-year-old woman said in an interview, "We call this freedom, but it's actually freedom under pressure, freedom forced to exist." This community took shape quickly as a miniature society moving constantly on wheels. Inside are workers who have lost their jobs, pensioners who cannot afford rent, and also teleworkers who are trying to save every penny to pay off their debts. They meet in RV parks, share food, survival experiences, and even stories about life once normal. RVs become homes, offices, bedrooms, and mobile warehouses containing all their possessions and memories. However, that mobile thing is not cheap. Gasoline prices are increasing rapidly, maintenance, repair, car insurance costs, and especially RV parking fees are increasing. Some cities such as Los Angeles or Phoenix have begun to limit parking areas overnight, forcing them to move continuously, living in a permanent temporary state. For many people, every morning is a new negotiation between fuel costs, food, and hoping there's enough money left to move on. The free feeling they have today is essentially freedom from obligations where they can no longer afford to maintain mortgages, taxes, utility bills, and constantly rising rents. But it's conditional freedom, because they can't stop. Stopping means being chased, fined, deported from where they park their car. Life on the road is not an adventure, but a quiet evacuation of the middle class, who still believe that stable is something that can be regained, just take a little harder. But reality shows that the system no longer has room for them to return. House prices continue to escalate. Mortgage rates are the highest in 2 decades, and the gap between rich and poor is widening. Van life thus becomes a symbol of painful adaptation, where people turn vehicles into a home and freedom into survival. Van life, with middle-class Americans today, is no longer a symbol of escape from the system. It is proof that the system has pushed them out. If the generation of parents once considered buying a house as the starting point of life, then for their children, it is a dream that is drifting away like a faded photo. Their parents used to buy houses for only 3 times their annual income, and today's generation faces prices 8-10 times higher. The house, once a reward for labour, has now become a contest for who can stay longer in an economy that is no longer fair. In houses where 2 generations live together, the feeling of failure creeps in like a nameless shadow. It comes not from laziness, but from a distorted economic reality. They work hard, study properly, follow all the advice of their parents, and then realise that the same rules that once helped parents succeed are now trapping them. A generation that grew up with the promise, if you study hard, you will have a better future, now faces the opposite truth. They are the first generation to do everything right, but live worse than their parents. The loss of home ownership is not just a financial failure, it is the breakdown of a cultural icon. For their parents, the house is the root, is where the family gathers, where the children grow up, where each brick symbolises faith in the future. As for their children, house is just a fragile concept. It could be a temporary rented apartment, a shared room, or even an RV parked in a Walmart parking lot. The gap between the two generations is measured not only in money, but also in trust in the system. Parents used to believe in America of opportunity, where anyone could move forward. Their children, although they still love this country, are gradually believing that the game has changed. When the iconic House of the Middle Class fell out of reach, the feeling of betrayal gradually grew. Today, when driving on suburban American roads, fewer new homes and more RVs are seen. One generation is learning to live on wheels, while the previous generation still clearly remembers the feeling of first laying the first brick for their home. And between those two images, fixed house and mobile car, is a generational void, not only in material things, but also in beliefs. The void between an America that once promised and an America that is changing so quickly that their children no longer recognize it. After the 2008 financial crisis, the United States set a series of policies to stabilize the economy. But instead of strengthening the foundations of the middle class, who once kept the social wheel running, the system accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, gave an advantage to investors. Turning the dream of people's home ownership becomes a game they can no longer participate in. Large corporations and investment funds began to buy a series of houses in residential areas that once belonged to the middle class. They buy in cash, faster and higher than any individual buyer can pay. When thousands of homes are pooled for rent or investment, house prices escalate out of control, pushing ordinary people out of the market. Middle-class people, who do not receive tax incentives or loans, gradually become outsiders in the very economy they once contributed to building. When they can't buy, they come to rent. But the shortage of affordable housing makes this option also deadlocked. Many middle-aged families, even those who used to have stable jobs, are forced to move into old RVs or trucks, not because they want mobile freedom, but because it is the only possible option left. A mobile home at least doesn't need to pay a mortgage, doesn't get evicted if the rent is late, and gives them a temporary feeling but still owns something, even if it's just a few square meters. Meanwhile, the government focused on subsidy programs for poor households, ignoring the growing gap in the middle class. They are not poor enough to get help, but they are also not rich enough to withstand escalating costs. It's the grey area of the policy where millions of people have to fend for themselves without any safety nets. Home loan interest rate, which was once considered a tool to encourage property ownership, has now become a barrier. In 2024, mortgage rates hit a 20-year high, leaving many insolvent, forced to sell their homes or face foreclosure. For them, stability is no longer measured by the value of the house, but by the fact that has a place to sleep tonight without penalty. At the same time, the benefits and pension insurance systems continue to weaken. More than 57 million Americans work without a retirement savings plan, and many seniors have to continue working just to pay for gas for the RV, where they spend the winter. They no longer dare to think about retirement, because retiring means falling into poverty. What used to be a personal risk, losing a job, losing a home, losing a retirement, now becomes a systematic risk. This trap is built from policy, from capital flow bias, and from how society defines success. When hardworking people are excluded from home ownership, when a policy of seeming neutrality only feeds inequality, the collapse of the middle class is no longer an isolated phenomenon, but an orderly process. And as night falls, the RVs lined up under the city's streetlights, the slow spinning wheels on the line between freedom and despair, is the most faithful portrait of a system that has lost those who once believed it most deeply. Outside, the RVs lit up at night like small spots of light in the vast desert. But inside them is a completely different world, where dreams quietly rot at the same time. People call this freedom on wheels, But with hundreds of thousands of Americans, especially those over 55 years old, it is freedom within a framework where every day is a new struggle with loneliness and mental stress. Many of them used to have stable lives, good jobs, private homes, savings accounts. They did everything right that society advised: to study, save, work hard. But as inflation, debt and rents rise uncontrollably, they are forced to leave the roof that was once a symbol of success. Now, life in an RV is the only option between sheltered poverty and outdoor poverty. For them, the feeling of stable has never really existed, despite working all their lives. What they have is just temporary safety. Today, enough gas, enough food, enough strength to move on. But the anxiety is still simmering. Is the car broken? Is the parking permit revoked? Is there still a place to sleep tomorrow? It is that prolonged uncertainty that creates a new form of depression. Silent depression. Silent depression. Psychologists call this collective emotional disintegration, when thousands of people have the same feeling of failure, but no one dares to admit it. They don't consider themselves homeless because they still have the car, but they are also no longer people with houses. They are stuck between two worlds. Lucky enough not to have been forgotten, but poor enough not to be able to return. In RV parks, conversations often revolve around how to save more. Where is safer? Where is, or with free Wi-Fi? No one talks about the future, because the future is a luxury concept. A 59-year-old man who used to be a teacher said, "We don't have severe depression. We just tired of being okay." That statement deeply engraves the contradiction of an entire generation of who have lived their entire lives in search of peace. But in the end, there is only a temporary and permanent form of life left. RV, symbol of freedom, now becomes a mobile prison for those who once believed they were settled down. They're still driving, they're still moving, they're still smiling at strangers. But behind the wheel is an empty nameless, when the roads no longer lead anywhere, but only last forever as a metaphor of waiting. Waiting for an opportunity, waiting for a miracle, or simply wait until the car stops one last time. And perhaps the most heartbreaking thing is not that they lost their home, but that they lost the feeling of being seen in a society that once promised to leave no one behind. As RVs roll in the American sunset, they carry more than humans. They carry fragments of the American dream. A dream once built of faith, labor, and hope is now surviving in the form of mobile homes, running forever without knowing where to stop. The middle class, pillar that once supported the nation, is now a traveler in its own homeland. They still believe in old values, hard work, frugality, self-reliance. But the world around them has changed so quickly. Homes, jobs, and the safety once promised are now just memories. Under the nightlights reflecting on the silver paint of old RVs, an America running parallel can be clearly seen. An America of light, and an America trying not to let the darkness swallow it. Can we go back to the prosperity period? And if so, how? Because if a country that once promised that everyone had a chance now lets millions of people live temporarily on wheels, then perhaps the problem is no longer the economy, but the meaning of being American today. If this story makes you touch something in your heart, a memory, a worry, or just sympathy, click, like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to continue our journey to explore the hidden corners of contemporary America. Because sometimes, to understand a dream, we must follow the very place where it is gradually disappearing. The video builds on public sources, economic reports, and true stories recorded from many American communities living in RVs or directly affected by the housing crisis. The purpose of the content is not to criticize, conclude, or blame any individual, organization, or government, but to reflect the ongoing social phenomenon in a neutral and humane way. All figures, statements, and citations are used with reference, are not absolutely affirmative, and may change over time or from new statistical sources. Viewers are encouraged to self-verify information from official sources and understand that video content is intended for educational, research, and public awareness purposes, not for political or commercial purposes.